Everyone thought I was just a grieving widow in Savannah, too quiet to matter after my husband's death. They didn't know Patrick left me more than memories. He left me a secret fortune. $28 million hidden behind names and doors no one else could see. Only my lawyer and I knew. Not my son. Not his new wife, Cassidy. The one who smiled too brightly and reached too quickly. She thought I was an old woman she could outsmart. But I wasn't raised to show my cards to a woman with hands that eager. And the trap I set for her changed everything. Savannah in springtime is a place that can break your heart with beauty. The air is thick with the sweetness of magnolias, and even in grief, the world insists on blooming. That was the day I buried Patrick, my husband, my partner through 5 decades of ordinary days and quiet sacrifices. The church was packed, but it didn't feel like mine. Marco stood tall and stiff, trying to be the strong one. Beside him, Cassidy looked as though she had been born for tragedy, dabbing her eyes just so. Her black dress tailored sharp enough to slice through sympathy. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years filled the pews. Their voices buzzed like bees in a jar, too polished, too rehearsed. When the service ended, I let them press my hands, whisper condolences, and sweep out under the heavy doors, leaving behind the faint scent of lilies and furniture polish. The grave itself sat beneath a magnolia tree, petals drifting down as if the world were throwing confetti at the wrong kind of party. I stood there longer than the others, listening to the birds, waiting for silence to settle in my bones. That's when I felt the shift. The strange quiet inside me that comes not from loss, but from knowing something no one else does. The will reading came later that week. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, the kind of furniture Patrick always admired but never bought. Myrna, my lawyer and my dear friend, sat beside me. Her presence was a comfort, like a hand pressed firm against the small of my back, steadying me when I felt invisible. Cassidy all but glowed when the papers were opened. Her eyes darted like sparrows as Patrick's assets were named. Properties, investments, trusts. And then came the line that made her beam like a girl handed a crown. Marco, my son, was the primary heir. No mention of me. Not in the way they expected, anyway. Cassidy's smile was almost too big for the room. I swear she reached out and squeezed Marco's hand under the table, as if she had just won something herself. Marco, poor boy, didn't notice. He was too caught up in grief and responsibility, trying to do right by everyone. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, the widow in black. Forgotten, or so they thought. But Patrick had left me something far more important than the showy sums on that paper. He had left me instructions, whispered between morphine dreams and the thin hours when I thought he slept. "Elena," he had said one night, his breath weak, his hand clinging to mine. "It isn't all gone. They'll think it is, but it isn't. Myrna knows. Trust her. Protect Marco." And so I did. What the others didn't know, and what Cassidy would never dream, was that Patrick had spent years weaving a quiet web of trusts and shell companies, each holding pieces of something larger. Offshore accounts, bearer bonds, properties under names no one would recognize. It wasn't glamorous. It was tedious, careful work, the kind of thing Patrick excelled at. When all of it was counted, hidden beneath layers of silence and secrecy, the sum rested at $28.4 million. A number so big it almost didn't feel real, like monopoly money. Only Myrna and I knew. That night after the will reading, I went home to the house that smelled of old wood and lemon oil, the house Patrick and I had filled with books and quiet rituals. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the garden we had tended together. I could still hear Cassidy's laughter in my ears, the brittle sound of victory. Let her think what she wanted. Let her believe I had been erased, overlooked, left to sip tea in the shadow of my own son's inheritance. I knew the truth. The fortune wasn't for me to spend on gowns or cruises. I had no appetite for such things. It was for protection, for dignity, For Marco's future if he ever found the courage to live it without being dragged down by someone else's greed. And so I stayed silent. I tucked Patrick's secret inside me like a seed, trusting the day would come when I might need to let it bloom. That night, I touched his empty side of the bed, still dented with his shape, and whispered into the dark, "Don't worry, Patrick. I'll guard it. I'll guard him." I remember standing at Patrick's grave, arranging the flowers just so I noticed him. A man in a dark suit, standing a little too far from the others, his posture rigid, his hands clasped like he was attending a meeting instead of a burial. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He only watched. I told myself he might be one of Patrick's old business associates. He'd known people from New York, Houston, even London. But something about him unsettled me. When the last guest left, he was still there, silent as the magnolia branches swaying above us. I turned my face away, pretending not to notice. When I looked back, he was gone. Weeks later, I spotted him again. Once on Bull Street, near the cathedral, standing in line for coffee but never ordering. Another time on Whitaker, leaning against a lamppost, eyes hidden behind sunglasses though the sky was gray. Each time his presence was brief, but unmistakable. I did not mention it to Marco. My son's grief had already settled heavy on his shoulders. He was trying to manage the accounts, the house, and Cassidy's ever-growing demands. He didn't need his mother whispering about shadows in Savannah. But I did mention it to Myrna. We were sitting in her office, the blinds half-drawn, the smell of old paper and ink filling the room. Myrna was the kind of woman who never wasted words. She had been our lawyer for decades, but more than that, she had been my friend. "Myrna," I said softly, "do you believe in watchers?" Her pen paused mid-scribble. "Tell me what you mean." I described the man, the grave, the street corners, the stillness of his presence, as though he wasn't really part of the scene but dropped into it like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Myrna leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Elena, you're not imagining things. The FBI has been asking questions." The words chilled me more than any ghost could. She explained carefully, as if each word were a fragile glass she might drop. In recent weeks, investigators had begun sniffing around transfers linked to Patrick's old companies. Offshore accounts, movement between trusts. Nothing illegal in itself, but the kind of activity that sets off alarms when men in suits get bored. "They think it's suspicious," she said. "Too many shells, too many doors leading nowhere. They don't know it was Patrick's way of protecting what mattered." "And the man in the cemetery?" I asked. Myrna's mouth tightened. "Could be an agent. Could be someone else who caught wind of the same trail. Either way, they're looking." I wrapped my shawl tighter around me though the room was warm. For the first time, I felt the weight of what Patrick had left me. Not just the millions, but the responsibility. Money may be paper and numbers, but when it grows too large, it attracts attention like sugar draws ants. That night, I walked the garden alone. The magnolia tree whispered overhead, petals scattering like pale coins. I thought of Patrick's last words, his trust in me, his warning. I wondered if he had known this would happen, that his careful web would eventually be tugged by hands we could not see. I should have been frightened. A 70-year-old widow with nothing but a small house, a grown son and secrets too heavy to carry. But instead I felt something else, resolve. I would not be bullied by a man in a suit. Nor would I let Cassidy, with her quick smiles and sharper ambitions, pry into what was not hers. Still the questions lingered. Was I under surveillance? Or was I simply a woman sitting on a fortune, waiting for the wolves to circle? The next morning I found myself watching the street from behind my lace curtains. The neighborhood looked the same as always, children riding bicycles, a dog barking at a passing car, the postman dropping letters into boxes. Yet beneath the ordinary hum of life, I sensed a new rhythm, the quiet tick of eyes unseen. I brewed tea the way Patrick liked it, strong with a slice of lemon, and sat at the table with Myrna's words echoing in my mind. The FBI has begun sniffing around. Well, let them sniff. Let them circle. I had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous thing you can do is let people see your fear. I folded my hands around the warm cup and whispered, more to myself than to the air. They'll find nothing. Not from me. Not now. And so I waited. Watched. Listened. The man in the suit did not vanish. He became part of the scenery, a shadow stitched into Savannah's sunlit streets. And though my heart beat faster each time I caught his gaze, I reminded myself, I was not powerless. I had Myrna. I had Patrick's instructions. And most of all, I had silence. Because silence, my dears, is a weapon sharper than any knife. One day Cassidy knocked on my door. She didn't come with flowers or pie, the way new brides sometimes do to win favor with their mother-in-law. No, she arrived with a folder tucked under her arm and a smile as polished as her pearls. The afternoon light was slanting through the magnolia branches, painting shadows across my porch. I remember thinking how quiet the street was, too quiet, the kind that makes you notice even the smallest sound. Cassidy's heels clicked like a metronome as she stepped inside. "Mother Elena," she said, her voice sweet but sharp around the edges. "I thought it'd be best if we talked, just us women." I led her to the sitting room, the same place where Patrick and I had read the paper together every morning for years. It smelled of lemon polish and old books. Cassidy sat straight-backed on the sofa, knees crossed, folder placed neatly on the coffee table between us. "I know things have been complicated since Patrick's passing," she began, tilting her head like she was speaking to a child. "And I thought it would be best for everyone if we consolidated assets. For the family's sake, of course." There it was. The words slipped out so smoothly I almost admired her. Almost. I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't even glance at it. Instead, I poured us both a glass of sweet tea, the kind with a sprig of mint from my garden. I slid one glass toward her. She smiled but didn't drink. "And what would this consolidation involve?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, as though I were just an old woman trying to understand. She leaned forward, tapping the folder with her manicured nail. "Just a simple agreement, really. Marco and I would take on the management of your accounts, properties, anything that might feel overwhelming to you right now. That way you can rest. Focus on healing." The way she said rest made me want to laugh. She meant surrender. I pressed my lips into a small smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals. "That's very thoughtful, dear. But I do worry about making big decisions while I'm still adjusting." Cassidy's eyes flickered just for a moment. A spark of impatience, quickly smothered beneath her polished exterior. Of course. But really there's no rush. Just remember, this is for everyone's good. Families are strongest when they work together. She slid the folder an inch closer to me. The paper inside made the faintest whisper, like a snake's tail in dry grass. I did not open it. Instead, I set my teacup down carefully and folded my hands in my lap. "You must be tired from the wedding, Cassidy," I said gently. "All that planning, all those details. Why don't you take this time to enjoy being a new bride?" Her lips pressed into that practiced smile again. "Marco and I are building a future. We need to make sure the foundation is solid." I nodded, pretending to mull it over. "You're a very determined young woman. Patrick would have admired that." The truth was, Patrick would have seen through her in a heartbeat. But Cassidy didn't need to know that. She left the folder behind, deliberately, as though she were planting a seed that would grow in my absence. "Just look it over," she said at the door. "No pressure. We're family now, after all." Family. Such a convenient word. Tossed around like a fishing net meant to catch whatever it could. When the door closed behind her, I sat for a long time in the silence of my sitting room. The folder stared at me from the table, waiting. Finally, I picked it up, not to read it, but to tuck it into the drawer of Patrick's desk. I'd let it sit there untouched, until I was ready to deal with it properly. That evening I sat on the porch with a shawl over my shoulders, watching the fireflies blink across the lawn. I thought of Patrick, of the trust he had placed in me. And I thought of Cassidy, her hands too eager, her eyes too bright with ambition. I sipped my tea and spoke softly, the way I always did when I wanted to remind myself who I was. I was not raised to show my cards to a woman with hands that eager. Let Cassidy think she had one around. Let her believe I was tired, uncertain, willing to hand over everything just to make life easier. She could think what she liked. I knew better. The days that followed, Cassidy hovered like a bird of prey. Phone calls to Marco, subtle hints dropped in conversation, a smile here, a frown there. She wanted me to feel pressured, boxed in. But the more she pressed, the quieter I became. Silence is a language all its own. One Cassidy had not yet learned to fear. But she would. Because while she thought she was the only one laying traps, she didn't realize I had been taught by the best. Patrick had left me with more than money. He had left me with patience, and patience, my dear, is sharper than any blade. And as I sat in that old Savannah house, listening to the creak of the shutters and the hum of cicadas, I began to form a plan of my own. When you've lived 70 years, sweetheart, you learn that some battles are not fought with shouting or fists. They're fought with silence, patience, and a little bit of cleverness. Cassidy thought she had the upper hand with her folder of papers and her sugar-sweet words. What she didn't know was that Myrna and I had already begun laying the groundwork for a little test of our own. Myrna came by one Tuesday afternoon, just as the magnolia blooms were beginning to brown at the edges and fall to the grass. She carried her leather briefcase, the same one she'd had for as long as I'd known her, the corners worn soft with time. "Elena," she said, closing the door behind her, "I think it's time we give that girl exactly what she's been asking for." I raised an eyebrow. Myrna never rushed into anything. "And what's that?" "A glimpse of money she'll never touch." We sat at Patrick's old desk, the one with the ink stains and the drawer that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. Myrna spread out her papers like a gambler laying down cards. Here was the plan. We would create a financial statement for an account that didn't exist. A neat little bundle showing a sum of $2. $3 million tucked away, looking legitimate enough to tempt, but empty once touched. More than that, Myrna's associate, an expert in digital forensics, would embed what she called a trap mark. "It's a digital watermark, invisible to the naked eye," Myrna explained. "If Cassidy forwards the file, prints it, or tries to use it to access the account, we'll know exactly when and where." I listened carefully, my fingers laced together on the desk. "So she thinks she's getting gold, but all she's really holding is tin." Myrna smiled thinly. "Precisely." That evening I brewed tea for us both, real china cups, because some conversations deserve ceremony. We talked about Patrick, about his care in building those layers of trusts and shell companies. How he had always worried Marco would inherit too much without knowing how to stand on his own feet. "He wanted to protect you both," Myrna said softly. "And now, Elena, that means protecting Marco from her." I nodded. I had already known it in my heart, but hearing it aloud gave me strength. The next day I invited Cassidy over. I told her I'd been thinking about her proposal, that maybe she was right. Maybe I did need help sorting through things. She arrived in a flash, heels clicking, perfume lingering in the hall. I kept my shoulders slightly hunched, my voice softer than usual. Let her see what she wanted to see. A tired widow worn thin by grief. "Cassidy," I said, sliding the folder toward her across the table, "I've been looking through some of Patrick's old accounts. It's overwhelming, really. But I thought you should see this one. Maybe you can help Marco decide what to do with it." Her eyes lit up before she even touched the papers. That hunger, it was right there, flickering like fire in dry grass. She tried to mask it, of course, pursing her lips, saying, "Oh, well, if you're sure." But her fingers trembled just a little when she opened the folder. I poured her a glass of sweet tea, the ice clinking while she skimmed the numbers. 2.3 million, she whispered, almost to herself. Then louder, "This is a good start. We can build from here." I hid my smile behind the rim of my teacup. She asked a few questions, nothing too pointed. Then she slipped the folder neatly back into her bag, patting it like a prize. "You're doing the right thing," she told me, her smile wide and warm. "Patrick would want us all working together." I only nodded. When she left, her perfume lingered in the house long after her footsteps faded down the walk. I sat very still, listening to the creak of the old wood around me, feeling the way silence can sometimes be louder than words. Later that night I called Myrna. "She took it," I said simply. "Good," Myrna replied. "Now we wait." And so we did. Days passed, then a week. The house was quiet, save for the hum of cicadas outside and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I busied myself with small tasks, watering the garden, mending a hem, baking a pie. Outwardly, life looked the same, but underneath I was watching, waiting. And then it came. Myrna rang me one morning, her voice brisk. "Someone just tried to access the account tied to that statement. Cassidy's fingerprints are all over it." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. It wasn't joy I felt, it was something colder, heavier. Confirmation. I walked through the garden that evening, the air heavy with jasmine. My heart ached not for Cassidy. Her greed was her own doing, but for Marco. My boy, still blinded by love, still believing in the woman who had already betrayed him. I knelt by the magnolia tree and pressed my palm against the earth, as though Patrick might hear me beneath it. "Your plan worked, my love," I whispered. "But it's a bitter victory." Cassidy thought she had gained ground. She thought she held the reins now. But all she really held was proof. Proof of her own intentions. Proof that she could never be trusted. And I, the widow she thought too tired to resist, had just taken the first step in a longer game. Because sometimes, dear, the strongest move you can make is not to fight outright, but to set a trap, sit quietly, and let the impatient ones catch themselves. It was the middle of the night when I first heard it. The sound wasn't loud, not like in the movies where doors slam and glass shatters. No, this was softer. Paper rustling, drawers sliding open, the faint creak of wood under careful feet. But after a lifetime in the same house, you learn every sigh and groan of its bones. This sound didn't belong. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding like a drum. The magnolia outside my window cast shadows across the wall, and for a moment I thought of Patrick. He would have grabbed the baseball bat from the closet and stormed down the hall without hesitation. But Patrick was gone, and all that was left was me, 70 years old with more secrets than strength. I slipped my feet into slippers and reached for the lamp. I didn't turn it on. Light only tells a trespasser where you are. Instead, I moved quietly to the door and cracked it open. The faint glow from the study stretched down the hallway like a path of breadcrumbs. Someone was in there. I stayed still just long enough to gather my breath, then stepped back into my room and picked up the phone. Myrna's number was already at the top of my call list. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert the instant she heard my whisper. "There's someone in the house," I told her. "Stay put. Don't try to stop them," she ordered. "Call the police." But I didn't. Not right away. I wanted to know what they were after. By the time I reached the study doorway, the intruder was gone. The desk drawers were open, papers strewn across the floor. Books lay at odd angles, their spines bent. But nothing of true value. The deeds, the trust documents, Patrick's hidden trail was kept here. Only one thing was missing. A small metal tin from the shelf. It wasn't even locked, just tucked away among the family albums and old tax returns. Inside were yellowed receipts, letters from Patrick's younger days, and a handful of forgotten photographs. Nothing worth stealing unless you knew what to look for. I stood in the wreckage of my study, the air still carrying the faint smell of cologne that wasn't Patrick's. My hands trembled, but not from fear. No, it was anger. Not only had someone broken into my home, they had done it with a purpose. 2 days later, Myrna called again. Her voice was brisk, but I could hear the unease underneath. "Elena, you need to sit down." "I am sitting." The tin turned up in a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Savannah police raided the place last night. Turns out it's tied to a criminal ring already under federal investigation. Money laundering, fraud, offshore accounts. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. And my tin, placed neatly on a desk as if it belonged there. "Elena, someone is trying to link you to their crimes." I felt the world tilt. It wasn't enough that Cassidy had tried to snatch at the bait Myrna and I had set. Now someone wanted me painted into a larger, darker picture. I thought back to the man in the dark suit at the cemetery, the one who had lingered too long. Myrna had said the FBI was watching, sniffing around Patrick's old accounts. What if this wasn't just Cassidy's greed? What if there were others circling, hungrier, more dangerous? That night I walked the house room by room, checking locks, closing shutters, pressing my palm against the old wood as though Patrick might steady me through it. I brewed tea at midnight and sat at the kitchen table, the clock ticking louder with each second. "Are you listening, Patrick?" I whispered into the quiet. "They're trying to drag me into the fire you left behind." The next morning I found Marco in the garden, his hands full of tools, trying to fix the trellis Patrick had built years ago. My boy was sweating in the spring heat, his shirt sticking to his back, his brow furrowed in concentration. I almost told him everything right then, the break-in, the missing tin, the warehouse. But when he looked up at me and smiled, weary but genuine, I swallowed the words. He was grieving, still adjusting to marriage, to responsibilities he didn't ask for. Telling him now would only burden him. Instead, I touched his arm and said, "Be careful who you trust, son. Not everyone who smiles at you means you well." He laughed softly, thinking I was just being an overprotective mother. But one day I knew he'd understand. Later, Myrna stopped by with the tin. She set it on my kitchen table like a piece of evidence. "Whoever planted it wanted you caught up in their net," she said. "If the FBI had found it there, Elena, you'd be answering questions you don't deserve." I traced my fingers over the cool metal lid. "So this is what it comes to. They'll steal from me, smear me, do anything to take what Patrick built." Myrna leaned forward. "That's why we need to stay 2 steps ahead. Don't let fear decide for you. Let's keep our eyes open." That night, I locked the tin away, not because it mattered. Its contents were ordinary, but because of what it represented. Someone wanted me tangled in their lies. Someone wanted me weakened, distracted, afraid. But fear is a seed you can choose not to water. I brewed a final cup of tea and carried it out to the porch. The night air was heavy with magnolia scent, the crickets steady in their song. I rocked slowly in Patrick's old chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and whispered into the dark. "They may have broken into my house, but they haven't broken me." And I promised myself right then, whatever storm was gathering, I would face it with silence, patience, and the kind of strength Patrick always knew I had. Because if they thought a widow in Savannah was easy prey, they hadn't reckoned with what love, loss, and 70 years of living had taught me. Myrna has never been the kind of woman to waste words. When she calls and tells me, "I found something you need to see," I don't ask questions, I just put on my shoes and walk to her office. The afternoon air was heavy, the kind that settles on your skin like damp cloth. By the time I climbed the steps to her building, I felt every one of my 70 years. But when I saw the look on Myrna's face, serious, tight around the eyes, I knew the weight I carried wasn't just mine. She didn't sit me down right away. Instead, she walked me straight to the back, where the little television sat on her filing cabinet. She slipped in a disc, pressed play, and folded her arms. The screen flickered to life, the grainy footage of a wedding reception. My son's wedding reception. I recognized the room instantly. The chandeliers, the linen-draped tables, the smiling faces of people who never once looked at me that night. The music played faintly in the background, couples dancing, laughter spilling from champagne flutes. Then the camera shifted, a little shaky, catching Cassidy in the corner with her friend. She held a glass high, her lipstick smudged just so, her eyes glittering. She leaned in close, her voice low but caught by the microphone anyway. "The feds won't know what hit them," she whispered. "Give me a year, and Marco will sign everything." My stomach turned cold. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles ached. On the screen, Cassidy laughed and clinked her glass against her friend's. The music swelled, drowning out the rest. Myrna hit pause. The frozen frame showed Cassidy mid-laugh, looking radiant, triumphant, dangerous. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I whispered, "She's not just greedy. She's reckless. She's playing with fire." Myrna nodded slowly. "And dragging Marco into it. Elena, this isn't only about inheritance anymore. She's talking about the FBI. About fraud. If she tries to use your name or Patrick's accounts, she'll burn us all." I finished for her. I sank into the chair, the leather cool against my arms. Myrna poured me a glass of water and set it in front of me, but my hands were too unsteady to lift it. I thought of my boy, my Marco. So earnest, so desperate to be the man Patrick wanted him to be. He had always followed rules, trusted too easily, loved too hard. He hadn't seen the way Cassidy's eyes sharpened when money was mentioned. He hadn't caught the edge in her laughter when people praised her. But I had. And now I had proof. I leaned back, letting the silence settle between us. "Myrna," I said finally, "I can't confront her. Not yet. If I do, she'll twist it. Marco will believe her, not me. He's still under her spell. So what do you want to do?" I folded my hands in my lap. They trembled, but my voice did not. "We wait. We keep this safe until the moment comes when Marco can see with his own eyes. If I tell him now, it will sound like jealousy, bitterness. But if he hears her voice, her words, then he can't deny it," Myrna finished. I nodded. That night I sat in Patrick's old armchair, the disc tucked into my purse like a secret heartbeat. The house was quiet, the magnolia tree tapping against the window with the evening breeze. I imagined Patrick sitting across from me, pipe in hand, eyes crinkling with that half-smile of his. "You always said patience was my greatest flaw," I whispered into the dark. "Well, Patrick, now it's my weapon." I thought of Cassidy, her laughter, her champagne glass, her whispered promise to strip my son of everything. She thought herself clever, untouchable. But she had forgotten one thing. Secrets don't stay buried forever. The next morning I rose before dawn. I brewed tea, the kitchen filling with steam and the faint scent of mint. I set the disc in a plain envelope, sealed it with steady hands, and pressed it flat beneath a heavy book on Patrick's desk. Not yet, I thought. Not today. But the day would come when that envelope would be opened, and the truth would speak for itself. For now, silence was my shield, and patience my sharpest blade. There are moments in a mother's life when she has to tuck her words away and let silence carry the message. That's what I did with the envelope. It was a plain one, no markings, no return address, nothing to give away what lay inside. Just the disc with Cassidy's own words, her careless whisper at the wedding, her glass raised in secret triumph. I sealed it, smoothed the flap with my palm, and held it a moment longer than I needed to. Then I slipped it into Marco's hands. For later, I told him. He looked at me, puzzled, but didn't press. My boy had always respected my silences. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without question, kissed my forehead and went about his day. I sat on the porch afterward, rocking slowly as the magnolia leaves rustled overhead. My heart ached, but I knew I'd done right. Sometimes love means letting someone stumble into the truth on their own. Not long after, Cassidy announced a business trip. She was full of smiles and excuses, waving flight itineraries at Marco like a magician with a deck of cards. "It'll be good for us," she cooed. "Networking opportunities, investments, you'll see." Marco, always eager to please, agreed too quickly. He didn't notice the way her eyes darted when she spoke, how her hand tightened just a little too much on his arm. But I noticed. That evening I called Myrna. She listened carefully, then said, "Something's moving. Keep close to the phone." The morning they left for the airport, I felt the unease settle into my bones like a storm rolling in. I walked the garden, touching Patrick's magnolia tree, whispering to him as I often did. "Watch over him, Patrick," I murmured. "He doesn't see the wolves yet." The sun was barely up when Marco and Cassidy drove off. I stayed at the window, watching until their car disappeared down the street. My heart pounded like I was the one boarding a plane. Later that day the phone rang. It was Myrna. "Elena," she said, her voice brisk. "They didn't get on that flight." I gripped the receiver tighter. What happened? FBI agents intercepted Cassidy at the airport. Money laundering, offshore accounts, ties to criminal networks. Marco wasn't arrested, but he's shaken. They're questioning her as we speak. For a moment all I heard was the rush of blood in my ears. Then the tears came, not of relief, not entirely, but of sorrow. My poor boy. He had thought he was building a life with her, and now he was watching it crumble in the glare of federal lights. That evening Marco came by the house. He looked pale, exhausted, his shoulders sagging as though he'd aged 10 years in a day. "She's not who I thought she was," he said quietly, sinking into Patrick's old chair. "Mama, I don't understand." She said it was business opportunities, nothing illegal. I reached across the table, resting my hand over his. "Son, sometimes the people we love wear masks. We don't see what's underneath until the mask slips." He pressed his lips together, his eyes wet but angry. "The agent said her name was tied to international accounts. They said she was using me. Me, Mama. I was too blind to see it." I wanted to tell him about the envelope right then, to let him hear her own betrayal with his own ears. But I held back. The time wasn't right. He needed to come to it himself, to open that proof when the wound was raw enough for truth to settle in. When Marco finally left, his steps heavy on the porch, I sat alone in the darkened kitchen. The clock ticked steady on the wall, and I thought of Cassidy's laughter, her champagne glass raised high, her promise to take everything. She had played her game boldly. But now the board was tilting. The FBI would drag her into their web, and Marco, my boy, would have to decide whether he would follow her down or find his own footing. I whispered into the night, to Patrick, to myself, to the silence. It's begun. I knew the moment would come, the moment when Marco could no longer walk blind. The envelope had been sitting quietly in his jacket pocket for days, maybe weeks by then. Myrna and I had sealed inside it not only Cassidy's words, but the truth of everything he had refused to see. And one evening, after the airport chaos, after the FBI questions and Cassidy's sudden absence from his side, my son finally opened it. He came by the house late, shoulders hunched, his face pale under the porch light. He didn't even knock, just pushed open the door the way children do when they still believe their mother's house is their own. I found him in the sitting room, standing by Patrick's old chair, the envelope torn open in his hands. His voice was low, ragged. "Mama, I heard it. I heard her." I didn't ask what he meant. I only waited, my hands folded in my lap. "She said it herself," he went on, the words stumbling. "At the wedding. She said she'd have me sign everything. She laughed about the feds, about using me. He stopped then, pressing a hand over his eyes. How could I not see it? I rose slowly and touched his arm. Because, son, you wanted to believe in her. That's not weakness. That's love. And love makes fools of us all. We sat together in silence for a while, the only sound the steady tick of the mantel clock. Marco stared at the disc case, as though the plastic itself might betray him again. Finally he whispered, "What happens now?" I could have told him that Cassidy was already on the FBI's radar, that Myrna had warned she might not vanish quietly, that there were still questions about accounts and transfers that Patrick had hidden too well for anyone to untangle quickly. But I looked at my son, his hands rough, his face weary, and I knew what mattered most was not what happened next, but what choice he would make. The next week passed in a haze. Marco moved through his days like a man carrying stones in his pockets. He went to work, he returned home, but the light in him had dimmed. I kept the kettle hot and the door open, but I didn't push. A mother knows when to hold her tongue. One evening Myrna stopped by. She brought news. Cassidy had surfaced again in federal files, her name tied to accounts overseas, suspicious transfers bouncing through places no honest family business ever touched. The Bureau says she's slippery, Myrna told me. But they'll catch her. And Elena, they know you weren't involved. They've cleared you. I nodded, relief heavy in my chest, but my thoughts were only of Marco. And my boy. Myrna's voice softened. He needs to see he's not her shadow. He has to decide what kind of man he'll be. That night I found Marco in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with Patrick's old tools. He wasn't fixing the trellis anymore. He was digging, his hands black with soil. "What are you planting?" I asked gently. "Nothing," he said, brushing his forehead with his arm. "Just clearing space." And I understood. The following Sunday, he came inside with his shoulders straighter than I'd seen in weeks. He sat at the table, placed his hands flat against the wood, and looked me in the eye. "Mama," he said, "I won't chase her. I won't chase her money, her promises, or her lies. I see her now for what she is. And I see myself. I want my life to be mine." Tears burned my eyes, but I held them back. I only nodded. "The FBI told me she's tied to things bigger than I can imagine," he continued. "If she comes back, it won't be to make peace. But I won't be dragged into her fire." I reached across the table, covering his hands with mine. They were calloused, rougher than I remembered. Not the hands of a man who had inherited wealth, but of a man ready to build something on his own. "My boy had been blind," I whispered softly, "but now he sees." That night after Marco left, I sat in Patrick's armchair, the house wrapped in shadows. I thought of the envelope now torn open, its secret revealed. I thought of Cassidy somewhere out there weaving schemes that would one day ensnare her. And I thought of Marco finally standing on his own feet, no longer a son blinded by love but a man who could choose his path. I closed my eyes and breathed deep. The storm had not passed, not yet, but in that moment I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. There comes a time when a mother must hand over not just her trust, but her secrets. Patrick had left me with more than grief and memories. He had left me the quiet architecture of a hidden fortune, carefully tucked away behind layers of shell companies and trusts. And he had left me a safe. It wasn't buried in the ground or hidden behind a painting the way you see in films. No, Patrick chose something simpler, more practical. A thick steel safe in the back room of our house, disguised beneath a stack of old boxes and a moth-eaten quilt. No one would glance twice at it, yet inside it lay documents worth more than all the jewelry in Savannah combined. Deeds, bearer bonds, keys to accounts. The true sum of $28.4 million. I had never opened it since his passing. Myrna and I kept the card tucked away, untouched. But after Marco opened the envelope and saw Cassidy's treachery for himself, I knew it was time. One evening I called him over. He arrived still dusted with sawdust from his work. He had been helping a friend repair old furniture, his hands rough and smelling of pine. My heart ached with pride and sorrow both. "Marco," I said, motioning for him to sit at the kitchen table, "I have something for you." He looked wary as though he feared more bad news. But I reached into the drawer and pulled out a small magnetic card, plain and unmarked. I set it on the table between us. "This," I told him, "is the key to a safe your father left behind. Inside are documents that prove ownership, properties, trusts, accounts. Everything worth millions." His eyes widened, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you've seen Cassidy's true face. Because I believe you're ready to choose what kind of man you want to be. Not a pawn in her game, not a boy dazzled by promises, but a man with his own mind." He stared at the card, silent for a long time. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and relentless. Finally, he whispered, $28 million. "Mama, it doesn't even sound real." "It's real," I said softly. "But so is the cost of it. Money attracts shadows, Marco. It breeds greed, suspicion, even danger. You've seen what it did to Cassidy. You've seen what lengths others will go to just to sniff around it." He rubbed his hands over his face, groaning. "Do you know what I could do with that money? What anyone could do?" I reached across and touched his wrist. "Do you know what you'd lose if you let it own you?" He sat there for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly he picked up the card. He turned it in his fingers, the plastic catching the light, small and ordinary in appearance, yet carrying the weight of a fortune. And then, to my astonishment, he set it back down on the table with a firm click. "Mama," he said, his voice steady, "I don't want it. Not like this. Not with her shadow still clinging to it. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering if the next smile from someone is real, or just after my money. I'd rather build something with my own hands." Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. "Are you sure, son?" He nodded. "I want to live free. I want to earn my days, not buy them." Then, with a kind of quiet finality, he took the card in his hands once more, snapped it clean in two, and tossed the pieces into the fireplace. The plastic curled and melted, the air filling with the acrid scent of burnt secrets. I covered my mouth, half in shock, half in awe. Patrick had trusted me to guard that fortune, to keep it safe. But our boy had chosen something rarer than wealth: dignity. He turned to me, his face calm, his shoulders lighter than I had seen them in months. "I'll find my way, Mama. I don't need millions to prove who I am." That night, after he left, I stood by the cold ashes of the fireplace, the remains of the card buried beneath gray dust. For a long time I wondered if Patrick would be angry, if he'd feel all his careful planning had gone to waste. But as I pressed my hand against the magnolia tree outside, I felt only peace. Patrick had wanted Marco to stand tall, to grow into a man unshaken by greed. And somehow, against all odds, that's exactly what he had done. Cassidy disappeared as swiftly as she had entered our lives. One day she was everywhere, her perfume lingering in my hallway, her voice weaving dreams into Marco's ears. And then, after the airport and the FBI, she was gone. Myrna told me quietly that Cassidy's name had begun surfacing in more than one state, tied to schemes so tangled even the investigators struggled to follow them. "She's running," Myrna said. "And she'll keep running until they catch her." For me, that was enough. I didn't need revenge or the satisfaction of seeing her punished. Her absence was victory enough. Marco, meanwhile, surprised me. He didn't sulk or drown himself in bitterness the way some men might after betrayal. Instead, he picked up Patrick's old tools and began to build. Not mansions or empires, but small sturdy things, wooden chairs, tables, shelves. He opened a little workshop on the edge of town, the kind that smelled of pine shavings and varnish. At first, it was just neighbors stopping by, asking if he could fix a drawer or craft a bookshelf. But soon word spread. People admired his honesty, the strength of his hands, the quiet dignity in his work. When I visited, I watched him plane down a piece of oak, his brow furrowed, his shirt clinging with sweat. His hands were rough, nicked, strong, the hands of a man earning his way. I felt prouder than if he had been a millionaire. Sometimes he'd look up at me, smiling in that shy way he had as a boy. "Not much money in this, Mama," he'd say. And I'd answer, "More value than gold, son. More value than gold." As for me, I held on to silence. I never boasted about the inheritance still tucked away in trusts and shells. I never told neighbors about the millions Patrick had hidden. I let them think I was just a widow living quietly in Savannah, tending her magnolias and sipping her tea. Because what mattered wasn't the fortune itself. What mattered was that my restraint had preserved both it and something far more fragile, my son's dignity. Cassidy had come with her bright smile and sharp hunger. She had tried to snare him, to strip him down to nothing but a name on papers. But patience, my silence, my waiting, had shown him the truth in time. And he had chosen well. One warm evening I sat on the porch, the magnolia tree heavy with blossoms. Marco came by with a chair he had built just for me. Simple pine, sanded smooth, polished with oil until it gleamed. "It's not much," he said, setting it down. I ran my hand across the wood, feeling its strength. "It's everything, son." I sat in that chair, rocking gently as the fireflies lit the garden, and I felt a peace settle into me. The kind of peace that comes not from money or power, but from knowing you've protected what truly matters. My fortune remained intact, yes. But more than that, my son's honor remained whole. And that, dear, was my quiet victory. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.